She fell face first into the snow, the weight of her unborn child pulling her down like an anchor tied to a drowning heart. Eleanor gasped, the frozen air burning her lungs, her gloveless fingers clawing at the ice as if she could dig a future from beneath the frost. The wind screamed through the trees, bitter and merciless, as if the mountains themselves wanted her gone. Her wedding dress, now shredded and soaked, clung to her like a ghost of a promise already broken. He had left her here, walked away when the snow closed the pass, and survival meant choosing who mattered more, his name or her life. "You tricked me," he'd spat when he saw her belly swell beneath the lace. "You brought your shame to my door." Then he vanished with the last mule, leaving Eleanor with a rotting sled, 2 broken ribs, and a storm at her heels. She'd wandered 3 days without food, with only the child inside her to speak to. And now, with her knees buried in ice, her lips cracked and bleeding, and her heartbeat fading like a forgotten fire, she understood. This was where she would die. Alone. Betrayed. Cold. She whispered an apology to the life inside her, her breath fogging like a soul escaping, and let her eyes close. But then, footsteps. Not loud, not fast, but certain. Measured. Eleanor barely lifted her head, but through the falling snow, a shape emerged. A man, wrapped in fur from shoulder to shin, face shadowed by a hood, axe strapped across his back. His eyes were the only thing visible, dark, steady, unblinking. She tried to speak, but couldn't. Her throat was frozen, her body too far gone. But he said nothing. Just knelt beside her, pulled a thick fur-lined blanket from his pack, and wrapped it around her shoulders like a vow. Then, without a word, he lifted her into his arms, as if she weighed no more than a memory. The heat of him seeped through the wool, through her skin, and something inside her, a flicker, a breath, stirred. She didn't know who he was. Didn't care. Because for the first time since her husband rode away, someone had come back. He didn't speak, he didn't ask, he didn't turn away. He just carried her through the snow, slow and steady, like he was rescuing something worth keeping. And Eleanor, drifting in and out of the dark, thought only one thing: I'm still alive. The cabin appeared through the trees like a secret the mountains had kept for themselves. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, soft and gray against the white sky, and the scent of cedar hit Eleanor's frozen senses like something from another lifetime. She was barely conscious as he pushed the door open with one boot and carried her across the threshold into warmth so sudden it made her weep. He didn't speak, not a single word, as he laid her gently on a bed of furs beside the fire. His movements were swift but careful. He stoked the flames, ladled water from a steaming pot, pressed a tin cup to her lips with hands scarred and steady. Eleanor drank, her throat burning, her breath returning in shaky fragments. She tried to ask who he was, where she was, but the words died between her lips. He didn't answer. He only covered her in another thick blanket, placed a heated stone near her feet, and then stepped back into shadow as if unsure he was welcome even in his own home. She watched him from beneath half-lidded eyes, how he moved without noise, how his presence filled the room without needing sound. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in layered buckskin and furs. His face was hard, carved by cold and time, but his eyes were something else. Eyes that held storms, yes, but also something gentler. She reached for her stomach instinctively. The baby had not moved in hours. Her breath hitched. He saw the panic flash across her face and moved fast, kneeling beside her again, this time pressing his hand gently against the curve of her belly. She winced, but then there it was. A small kick. Weak, but alive. The man didn't smile, didn't react, just gave a single nod, stood, and returned to his chair by the fire. Eleanor watched him through the flicker of flames, trying to understand who he was and why he hadn't spoken. Her husband had shouted, the preacher had lectured, the midwife had warned. But this man said nothing. And somehow, that silence felt more like protection than all the words in the world. As the snow thickened outside and darkness draped itself over the windows, Eleanor closed her eyes again. Not from fear, not from pain, but from exhaustion. Safe. That's what it felt like. And in her final waking thought, she didn't wonder if she'd survive. She wondered who he was, and why he hadn't left. She woke to the sound of the wind scratching against the wooden walls, and the smell of something warm in the air. Meat, herbs, maybe beans. Eleanor blinked slowly, the cabin roof above her flickering with soft orange light from the hearth. Her body ached like it had been dragged back from the edge of death, which it had. She reached down, instinctively resting her hand on her belly, and felt the faintest movement. Still alive. So was she. Tears came before thought did, hot, relentless, and quiet. She curled slightly, pressing her fist to her mouth to stifle the sound, but it was no use. Every sob was the sound of memory clawing its way out. She remembered the night she was left, remembered calling his name while the snow swallowed his tracks, remembered thinking no one would ever come for her. And yet, someone had. The wooden door creaked open and the man stepped inside, snow clinging to his shoulders like frost on stone. His eyes went to her immediately. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer a word of comfort. But he set down his bag, removed his coat, and ladled soup into a tin bowl with the same calm precision as if her crying meant nothing, or maybe everything. He crossed the room, sat beside the bed, and handed her the bowl without a single question. Eleanor wiped her face, swallowed her shame, and took it. The broth was thick and hot and tasted like salvation. She ate in silence, every bite warming the cracks the cold had left in her bones. He watched her, but not with hunger or judgment. Just presence, stillness. When she finished, she cleared her throat. "I don't even know your name," she whispered. He hesitated. Then, finally, in a voice so low it felt like thunder trapped in a box, he said, "Gray." Just that. One word, deep and rough as the mountains. "I'm Eleanor," she whispered, as if it mattered. Gray nodded once. No questions followed. No remarks. He just stood, took her empty bowl, and returned to the fire like names were enough. She lay back against the pillow, eyes tracking the wooden beams above, trying to understand how a man could be so silent and yet louder than anyone she'd ever met. The fire cracked. The wind moaned outside. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, Eleanor felt something creep into her chest that she thought had died with her wedding vows. Hope. The days blurred into one another like brushstrokes on a canvas she didn't know she was part of. Snow still fell outside, but inside the cabin the world was warm, quiet, and strange. Gray didn't speak again. Not once. He moved like a shadow with purpose, feeding the stove, chopping wood, checking traps, boiling broth, carving spoons from branches. Everything he did was with his hands, not his voice, and Eleanor learned to read him the way she read weather, by signs and shifts and silence. He never asked where she came from, never asked about the child, never asked what kind of man would abandon a woman in the middle of a storm. He just brought her things, warm socks, a blanket he'd sewn patches into, dried berries from a leather pouch he left by her bedside without a note. It confused her at first, then comforted her, then began to break her in the best possible way. She sat by the window one morning, her stomach heavy and alive, and watched Gray work with his back to her, splitting logs with rhythmic precision, steam rising off his shoulders in the cold air. He was all strength and quiet. She wondered what he had lost to make him this way. No man is born silent. Silence is earned through pain. "You always live out here alone?" she asked one evening, her voice loud in the stillness. Gray didn't turn from the fire he was building, just gave the faintest nod. "And you built all this?" Another nod. "Why?" This time no answer, not even a movement, just the fire cracking between them and the heaviness of a man who had more reasons than words. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat by the hearth while he slept on the floor beside the door, a habit of someone who'd never trusted walls to keep danger out. She watched the flames flicker and imagined who he had been before he vanished into these mountains. A father? A husband? A soldier who saw too much? Or just a boy who trusted the wrong people and learned that silence survived longer than love? She didn't know, but she wanted to, and that frightened her more than the cold ever had. Because the more she healed, the more she stopped missing the man who left her. The more she started seeing Gray, not just the silence, but the soul hiding behind it. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. It started with a sound that didn't belong. Not the whisper of snow on the roof or the crackle of the fire, but something foreign. Metal on metal, hooves in the distance, voices sharpened by greed. Eleanor froze at the window, her breath fogging the glass. The forest didn't speak like that unless men were in it. Gray was gone, his rifle slung over his shoulder hours ago as he checked traps near the ridge. She was alone, and the voices were getting closer. She moved slowly, every step careful, her hand resting on her swollen belly like it could keep her steady. Through the trees, two men emerged, strangers in slick coats, faces red from whiskey or wind or both. One carried a pistol openly, the other a rusted shovel. They weren't looking for shelter. They were looking for something to take. They reached the porch before she had time to bar the door. One knocked once, twice, then simply pushed it open like the cabin belonged to the world. Eleanor stood by the table, spine straight, chin high. The man with the gun grinned, teeth yellow and cracked. "Well, now look at this. We thought this place was empty." The second one whistled. "Sure don't look empty to me." Eleanor didn't answer. Her heart pounded so loud she could barely hear them. The first man stepped inside, eyes crawling over everything. Gray's coat on the peg, the fire still alive, the blankets she'd folded that morning. "You here alone, sweetheart?" She stared at him. He took another step. "I asked you a question." "She's not," said a voice like gravel and thunder. Both men spun, but it was too late. Gray stood in the doorway, snow still melting on his shoulders, his rifle already raised. He didn't yell, didn't threaten. He just looked like a man who wouldn't ask twice. The pistol man raised his hands. "Didn't know this place was claimed." "It is." The second man backed toward the door, mumbling apologies. Gray said nothing more, but his eyes, cold, unwavering, made it clear what would happen if they didn't leave. They did. Fast. When they were gone, Gray lowered the rifle, turned to Eleanor, and looked at her like he was seeing something he hadn't before. Not fear, not fragility, but strength. She hadn't screamed, hadn't begged. She had stood tall while carrying life inside her. Gray nodded once, slow and deliberate, and for the first time, he spoke her name. "Eleanor?" Just that. Just her name. But in his mouth, it sounded like something sacred, and it told her everything she needed to know. She was no longer just a woman he saved. She was the woman he'd protect. The snow kept falling, but something in the cabin had begun to thaw. Days passed, and Gray no longer disappeared into the woods without telling her. Instead, he'd pause at the door, glance at her, and give a slight nod, as if silently saying, "I'll be back." He'd return with more than meat now. A pine branch dripping with sap to warm the air, a carved wooden bird for the baby, a bundle of sage he never explained. Eleanor watched him move through the world with quiet reverence, like the land had taught him to step carefully, speak only when it mattered, and carry pain like a second spine. But there were moments, small flickering cracks in his armor, where something warmer slipped through. One night, as a storm howled through the trees, the wind shaking the shutters like fists, the two of them sat by the fire. Eleanor with her hands on her belly, Gray sharpening a knife with the rhythm of a heartbeat. She broke the silence first. "Did you lose someone?" He didn't look up, but the scraping of stone on steel stopped. "Yes," he said. One word, but it opened something. "Who?" she asked softly. A long pause. Then, quieter than the storm outside, he said, "A wife. A daughter. Long time ago." Eleanor's throat tightened. She didn't press, just stared at the fire, feeling the weight of a man who had built a prison from his own sorrow and called it a cabin. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded once, as if that was all the grief allowed. Minutes passed in the hush between them. Then she felt it. A kick, hard and certain, her breath caught. She took his hand before he could retreat into silence and pressed it to her belly. The child moved again. Gray's eyes widened, his calloused fingers still against her skin, like he was afraid to scare the moment away. "He's strong," she said. Or she. "Like the mother," he murmured. She turned to him, startled by the softness in his voice. Their eyes met, and something shifted. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm, shared. As the fire cracked and the wind roared beyond the walls, Gray's hand remained where it was, not to steady her, but because he didn't want to let go. And Eleanor didn't ask him to. The world outside could be cold and cruel, but here, wrapped in flickering light, with his hand on the life she carried, there was only warmth. There was only the beginning of something neither of them had dared to believe in again. A family, not by blood, but by fire. It began with a sharp pain that sliced through Eleanor's side like lightning through dry pine. She dropped the ladle into the stew pot, clutching her belly, her breath caught somewhere between a scream and a prayer. The baby wasn't due yet, weeks, maybe more. But her body didn't care. Outside, the storm had returned, wilder than before. Sheets of snow hammering the windows, wind howling like a beast trying to claw its way inside. Gray turned from the door the second he heard the pot crash. In 2 strides he was beside her, steadying her as she doubled over, sweat already beading on her forehead. "It's time," she gasped, panic rising like floodwater. He didn't speak, didn't blink, just moved. He lifted her into his arms, carried her to the bed, and began gathering towels, water, blankets, everything he'd never had a reason to prepare until now. The fire blazed high, but she couldn't feel it. Her world narrowed to the pain, the pressure, the fear of bringing life into a world that had already tried so hard to take hers. Gray sat beside her, his hands strong and calm even when hers trembled. He didn't flinch when she cried out, didn't pull away when she crushed his fingers in hers. He stayed, through every contraction, every scream, every tear, and when she told him she couldn't, when she begged him to make it stop, he wiped her brow and whispered the first thing he'd said to her in hours. "You already have." She didn't know what he meant until the cry came, sharp, new, and angry, a sound so small and fierce it split the storm in half. The baby. A boy. Alive. Gray wrapped the child in a soft, fur-lined cloth and placed him in her arms with a gentleness that didn't belong in hands that had built a life from trees and silence. Eleanor stared at the tiny face, the wailing mouth, the clenched fists. Her heart cracked open, spilling every fear, every doubt, every memory of cold nights and colder goodbyes. She looked up at Gray, tears streaming. "He's here." Gray nodded, his voice thick. "He is." She took his hand and pressed it to the baby's chest. "You saved us." His jaw clenched, but his eyes shimmered in the firelight. "You brought him here." "No," she whispered. "We did." And in that moment, with snow piling against the windows and life nestled between them, there was nothing missing. Not warmth, not love, not family, only the silence of gratitude between two people who had nothing, and now had everything. The snow had barely begun to melt when the knock came. It wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. Eleanor froze where she stood, rocking the baby in her arms. Gray looked up from the table, where he was carving a new cradle from pine. His jaw tightened. 3 short knocks, the kind that don't ask permission, the kind that come from people who believe the door belongs to them. Gray moved to the rifle on the wall. Not in panic, just preparation. Eleanor shifted toward the hearth, shielding the baby instinctively, her heartbeat already sprinting. When Gray opened the door, 2 men stood outside, town deputies by the look of their vests, badges dulled by dust and ice. Behind them, 3 horses and a sleigh half buried in slush. The older one squinted inside, his voice dry and unimpressed. "We're looking for a woman. Pregnant, abandoned. Word is she might have survived the storm. Gray didn't move, didn't speak, just stood like stone in the doorway." The second deputy stepped forward, eyes drifting toward Eleanor and the child. "Ma'am," he said, tugging off his hat. "You Eleanor Pratt?" She hesitated. "I was. There's folks in town say your husband showed up alone, said you were taken, or worse." She laughed once, dry, sharp, bitter. "He left me, in the snow. I wasn't taken." The deputy scratched his head. "Still, folks think you might have died. The preacher's been raising funds for a funeral." Gray's grip tightened on the doorframe, but he said nothing. "So," the deputy continued, nodding toward the baby, "that his?" Eleanor didn't flinch. "He doesn't belong to the man who abandoned me. He belongs to the man who saved me." She looked up at Gray, her voice steady. "And we don't need anything from town. Not their money, not their pity, not their lies." The older deputy's face darkened. "That's a bold thing to say. Living out here with a—" He trailed off, glancing at Gray, and the word he almost said turned to dust in his mouth. Gray finally spoke, his voice a low growl. "You done?" The man stepped back. They didn't argue, didn't protest, just nodded stiffly, muttered something about records and leavin' names, then turned and vanished into the snow like ghosts who'd knocked on the wrong grave. Gray closed the door, locked it, turned to her. And in the silence that followed, something unspoken passed between them. The world hadn't forgotten them, but they had survived it anyway. Together. Eleanor cradled the baby closer, and Gray crossed the room, standing at her side as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside once more. They weren't hiding anymore. They were home. The fire was low, casting soft shadows on the cabin walls as Eleanor sat by the cradle, humming a lullaby she half remembered from childhood. The baby slept, cheeks rosy, one tiny hand curled in a fist above the blanket. Gray stood by the window, unmoving, arms crossed as he stared into the forest. It had been quiet for hours. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before a storm, or a confession. "You're thinking too loud," Eleanor said gently. Gray didn't turn. "They'll come again." "Let them," she replied. "We're not afraid anymore." "I didn't mean them," he said. His voice was low, ragged. "I meant the past." She watched him for a moment, then rose slowly, her body still recovering but strong again. She crossed the room and touched his arm. "Then tell me." He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. "I was married once," he began, eyes still on the trees. "Her name was Alma. We had a daughter. Lark." The names fell into the room like snow, soft but heavy. "They were killed," he continued, voice tightening, "by men wearing badges. Said I stole horses. Said I ran with outlaws. I didn't. But they didn't need proof. Just a reason." Eleanor's breath caught. "You watched it happen?" He nodded. "I came home to ashes. They lit the cabin. Didn't check if anyone was inside." She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears burning her eyes. "I hunted them. One by one. Buried the last one under the same snow they left me in. After that I stopped speaking. Figured silence was safer." Eleanor stepped closer, her hand finding his. "You built this place from the pieces they didn't burn." "I built it to disappear," he said. "Then you showed up, with a life inside you, with fire in your voice, and I couldn't disappear anymore." She squeezed his hand. "Gray, I didn't ask to be saved, and you didn't ask to be needed. But here we are." He finally turned, his eyes shining in the dim light. "I'm scared," he admitted, "of losing again." "So am I," she whispered. "But the only thing scarier than loss is not living because of it." They stood there, face to face, hands entwined, pasts bleeding into each other like old ink on wet paper. No promises, no lies, just truth. He kissed her then, not out of passion, but recognition. Two broken people who had survived more than most, and still chose each other. The wind howled again, but this time, it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a door closing behind them. They had finally said everything. And tomorrow, they would begin again. Spring arrived not with flowers, but with silence, the kind that crept in after a long fight and found its way into the bones. The snow melted slowly, revealing patches of earth and life beneath months of cold. Birds returned, trees budded cautiously, and inside the cabin, laughter bloomed before the first blossoms ever dared. Eleanor stood by the doorway, with the baby strapped to her chest, watching Gray hammer a new post into the garden fence. Each swing of his arm was strong, steady, like the man himself. Nathan, she had named the child. Not after her husband, not after anyone she owed a past to, but after the Hebrew word for gift, because that's what he was. Gray looked up from his work and caught her watching. He didn't smile. He never really did. But his eyes softened, and that was enough. He dropped the hammer and walked toward her, wiping sweat from his brow, the wind catching strands of his hair. "Ground's good this year," he said, glancing at the small patch she'd cleared for vegetables. "We'll plant next week," she replied. "Beans, maybe squash?" He nodded, then looked at the baby. "He grows fast." "Like his father?" she teased. Gray didn't correct her. She wasn't sure when it had happened, when he stopped being the man who saved her and became the man who belonged to her. Maybe it was the way he rose in the night without her asking to feed the baby. Maybe it was how he carved her spoons with flowers etched into the handle. Maybe it was the night he whispered her name like a prayer while holding her as if she were the last warmth on earth. Love had come slowly, quietly, like snowmelt through cracks in stone. But it had come. That evening, As the sun dipped low and painted the sky in fire, they sat on the porch together. The baby slept in Gray's arms, his tiny fingers curled around a strand of his beard. Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, her hand over his heart. "Do you think we'll ever leave this place?" she asked. Gray shook his head. "No need to. This is the end of the trail." "It feels like the beginning," she whispered. "Maybe it's both," he said. And in the hush that followed, they sat, wrapped in quiet, in peace, in something earned and sacred. Not everyone gets to start over. Not everyone finds love in the ashes. But they did. Because she survived. Because he stayed. Because the trail didn't end in the snow. It ended in arms that chose to hold, no matter how much had been lost before. And that was all they needed.